Well, from the sound of that bell, it sounds like it's time to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to History STL Live. I'm Tammy Goldman, Director of Tourism and Group Sales for the Missouri Historical Society. And thanks for attending this presentation, True Crime, Murder and Mayhem. Special thanks go out to our members and supporters of the Missouri Historical Society and the Zoo Museum District. Your generous support allows us to provide these programs and so much more. So today, this presentation will be 20 minutes. We have two presenters. After the 20-minute program, we'll follow with 10 minutes or so of question and answer. So how do you ask those questions? You ask. We have a Q&A function. It's a box down at the bottom. You can submit your questions there anytime during the presentation. However, the presenters won't answer until the end of the program. Again, you can submit those, and then at the end of the program, they'll both read them and answer your questions. Hopefully all that makes sense and you're excited, like I am, to get started with this wonderful program. So without further ado, let's get started. Our speakers today are both from the Missouri Historical Society. Amanda Clark is our Community Tours Manager, and Adam Kloppe is our Public Historian. They've developed a really fun and interesting program. I guess you can call True Crime fun. Anyway, I hope you enjoy. Thanks, Amanda and Adam, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Like Tammy just said, I am Amanda Clark, and in another world, I would be walking all of you around St. Louis and showing you lots of sights, and I can't wait to do that later in the summer. Adam, who are you?
Hi, so I'm Adam Kloppe. I'm a public historian with the Missouri Historical Society. So basically all that means is I read and research about history all day and I find ways to bring it to the public. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk to all of you about history of true crime in St. Louis.
We're just going to call it murder for the rest of the presentation, the history of murder. Yeah, when Adam and I were looking at different topics that we could do together, we thought, hey, how about something that makes people also not want to go outside their homes? So we went with crime and murder. but don't worry, it's ones that happened a long time ago and the murderers are long gone and the juries have all deliberated. So let's move forward. Before we talk about some specific stories, I always like to talk a little bit about the history of true crime consumption and, have people since the beginning of time loved learning about murder and crime, yes, but it wasn't until the 15th century that they were actually able to print those stories and spread those stories around. And then, of course, anything we can do weird, the Victorians will always do weirder. And the picture on the right that you see there, during the Victorian era, there was actually a thing such as true crime tourism. And in London, when a grisly murder was committed, people could actually buy tickets and buy admission to come see the crime scene. They could even buy souvenirs of the scene, such as a piece of fabric from the murder victim's clothing, things like that. So people for a long time have been fascinated by learning about things that did not happen to them. So I think that's really the thing is it's already happened to somebody else, not me. So first we're gonna talk about St. Louis. So before I let Adam take the mic, here's just a couple of little quick stories. On the far left, you see that big open room. That's the jail for the Four Courts building. That was the giant jail in downtown St. Louis. The girl in the middle, the super innocent looking Mary Catherine Reardon, she is in the 1940s. She's 14 in that photograph. She's a student at Clayton High School. She convinces her boyfriend, Michael, down there at the bottom, that they should run away together. Her father catches them in Wentzville and drives them back down to Clayton, and somewhere along the way, someone in the back seat grabs a gun and shoots the dad in the head as he's driving. And when the police come, he's ejected from the car and he dies. When the police come, Mary Catherine, unharmed, is out of the car and admits to everything, claiming that she knew her dad was going to make her go to private Catholic school, and that sounded boring, so she shot him. St. Louis and the country as a whole agreed she was way too cute and innocent looking to have committed that crime, and so she was acquitted. And this was a national murder story and one that I think deserves some revisiting.
Yeah, for sure.
And the handsome debonair guy on the right there, we're going to learn all about him towards the end. That's in the Missouri Historical Society collections. If you look up the word murder, in the image collections, you get that great photo there. And so we'll learn who he is later. All right, Adam, you ready?
I am.
You gonna talk about murder?
Well,
Murder?
you know, there's murder involved in my story, but one of my favorite crimes in St. Louis history is actually a theft. And it involves organized crime and murder and all sorts of stuff in the telling of it. So I'm really looking forward to getting into this one.
Tell us.
One of my favorite crimes is called the whiskey milking scandal, and it involved a gang in St. Louis called the Egan's Rats. So before I get to the scandal, I want to tell you a little bit about the Egan's Rats, which was one of the first sort of organized crime units in the city of St. Louis. They were predominantly an Irish group. We might today call them the Irish Mafia, though they wouldn't have used a term like that back when they were first founded. And the group was started by this gentleman in these pictures right here. This is Thomas Snake Kinney. He was born in 1868 in an area of St. Louis called the Carey Patch in the city's near north side. It's a historic Irish neighborhood. And when he was born there, you know, there was a lot of street gangs in the neighborhood. So as he's growing up, he is a smart kid, a tough kid. You know, he's sort of living on the streets to a degree, and he sort of takes up with one of these street gangs and becomes its leader, you know, and they're robbing, you know, small stores, they're pickpocketing, you know, they're committing assaults. They're a little gang in the area. And eventually Kinney sort of attracts more sort of street toughs to him as he's going, and his gang gets bigger and bigger. Eventually it even catches the eye of the city's Democratic Party. And not necessarily for the party to stop the gang from existing, but because the Democratic Party in this era of boss politics, when both Democrats and Republicans are doing whatever they can to win elections, the Democrats that control the city of St. Louis decide we're going to use this gang to intimidate voters up in that ward of the city. You know, we're going to scare voters who are going to vote for the Republicans away from the ballots. We're going to stuff ballot boxes for our preferred candidates, and we will use this gang to that end. So that is Snake Kinney's real introduction into politics, but he finds that he really, really likes it. And when he's 22 years old, he runs for and wins a seat on the city's Democratic Committee, a committee that is essentially deciding the platform for the entire Democratic Party in the city of St. Louis. So he becomes an elected official in the city of St. Louis at the age of 22. And you
Why not?
yeah, as you do, right? And you would think that would like scare him away from being involved in crime, but it didn't at all. He maintained really close ties with his gang. He used his political connections to meet wealthy St. Louisans. He got in very close to the Lemp brewing family, and eventually he ends up buying a saloon that is his gang's headquarters and everything like that. Eventually, and there's even more evidence, you know, that he didn't shy away from street life than just sort of, you know, saying it. He actually is involved in a pretty serious crime on September 20th of 1896. That day, he's walking down the street in the Carey Patch with several of his associates, and coming the other way is a man by the name of George Baldy Higgins. And Baldy Higgins led a rival gang. Kinney and Higgins did not like each other very much, and so a brawl erupts in the street between all their men. And during this brawl, it looks like Baldy Higgins is going to kill Tom Kinney, but he didn't know that Tom Kinney had a gun on him. So Kinney pulls out a gun and shoots Higgins to death in the street with witnesses. And you would think, well, that will end his political career. And it absolutely did not. He was acquitted of all charges. He never saw the inside of a jail cell for doing that. And his career just continued apace. So much so that in 1904, he's actually elected to the state Senate. He's elected, he goes to Jefferson City as a state senator. And he's not a do-nothing state senator either. You know, you think he might be corrupt. There's a Prohibition era gangster in St. Louis named Jelly Roll Hogan that's later elected to state Senate. And the big legislation his name is on is legalizing gambling in the state of Missouri. So, gee, I wonder what he was up to. But not Tom Kinney. His name is actually on some of the first child labor laws in the history of the state of Missouri. So he's really doing some good work there. He dies in 1912. He contracts tuberculosis. And actually, when he dies in 1912, his brother Michael Kinney takes over his state Senate seat and serves in the state Senate until the late 1960s. He's one of the longest serving elected officials in US history, is the brother of this murderer and gangster. But when Tom Kinney here died in 1912, his funeral was one of the biggest in the history of St. Louis. It had over 200 carriages, a 500-piece band, and over 500 honorary pallbearers. So, this gangster had quite a following. Can we go to the next slide?
Yeah.
So after he dies, the gang is taken over by Tom Egan, his Tom Kinney's best friend and brother-in-law. When Tom Egan dies, Willie Egan takes over the gang. And when Willie Egan dies, William Dint Colbeck takes over the gang in the early 1920s. Colbeck was a World War I veteran and sort of a long-time criminal, a career criminal, and he was kind of a secretive guy. Up until the time Colbeck took over the gang, their headquarters was always up in the Carey Patch neighborhood in various saloons up there. And Colbeck really didn't like that because he feared that anyone could just come into the saloons and hear his men talking about the criminal enterprises they were engaged in. So he actually moves their headquarters out to a place in what was then a rural part of St. Louis on St. Charles Rock Road, a place called the Maxwellton Club. And that place no longer exists. I've never seen a blueprint for it, but the rumor is that there was a racetrack that went around this bar. And the Egan's Rats didn't use this racetrack to hold races or do anything like that. They actually used this racetrack. They would set up empty bottles along the outside of it, and they would shoot at those bottles from moving cars to practice drive-by shootings that they were involved in as members of gangs. So Colbeck, he was a secretive guy. He was also kind of a flashy criminal. He got the gang really invested in bank robbery, something Willie Egan had done before him, but Colbeck gets really involved in that. And he also wants to pull off a really daring crime. And this is where we get into like one of my favorite things ever. So if we go to the next slide, I'll start talking about the whiskey milking scandal. So a little bit of background on this. In 1910, the state of Tennessee goes dry. They pass a prohibition law in Tennessee. You can't produce or distribute alcohol in the state. That's a big problem for Jack Daniels. That's their whole business, is making and distributing alcohol. So they moved their entire distilling operation to St. Louis. There's a number of reasons for that, including the fact that Missouri had a really strong alcohol lobby because of the brewers in St. Louis. Oh, go back.
Oh no! This is that like PowerPoint fear. There we go.
But one of the reasons they moved here is because of the strength of the alcohol lobby in Missouri. Because of all the brewers in St. Louis, they figure Missouri would be one of the last states to pass a prohibition law. Of course, the entire United States goes dry in 1920, and Jack Daniels is sort of out of luck. They have to stop making alcohol, but they had whiskey aging in barrels. So they rent a warehouse on Duncan Avenue, right near this distillery in St. Louis, and they fill it with about 1,000 barrels of whiskey. And it's guarded, the police know about it and all this stuff. Well, Dint Colbeck and a few other people in St. Louis, they know about this warehouse of whiskey, and they think, that's a gold mine. If we can just get our hands on that whiskey and distribute it, we can make a lot of money. So Colbeck's first plan is just to outright steal this whiskey, break into the warehouse and steal it. A few men break in, they steal about a dozen barrels of whiskey, but it takes a lot of work. They don't get away with as much whiskey as they want. And there's a lot of risk involved in carrying out these big, heavy barrels. It's time consuming and it's not practical. So Colbeck and some other associates of his start to develop a plan to get this whiskey out by other means. And they're helped along when actually one of Tom Kinney's brothers, not the one who was in the state Senate, a different brother named William Kinney, is hired as a guardsman at this warehouse. And they can sort of set this plan into motion. So what they do, somebody rents a warehouse just down the street and they fill it with empty barrels. And then when Kinney is there as a guardsman, usually at night, they would sneak into that warehouse full of Jack Daniels whiskey. They'd hook up a hose to a barrel of whiskey, and they'd walk that hose back over to the warehouse where they had these empty barrels. And then they would siphon the whiskey from the Jack Daniels warehouse back into their warehouse with the empty barrels. They would fill these barrels with whiskey from the Jack Daniels warehouse. Once Jack Daniels' barrel was empty, they would siphon back a mixture of vinegar and water so that the barrels would sound full. One of the things that inspectors would do to make sure the whiskey was still there is they would walk by these rows of barrels and just smack them with a stick to make sure they still sounded full, that there wasn't something leaking out that someone hadn't snuck in and stolen it. So they're making sure these barrels are full. The other way these inspectors are testing is that occasionally they'll pop open a barrel and take a sip of whiskey just to make sure, because you could still sell a little bit of alcohol for medicinal purposes. They just want to make sure it essentially wasn't poison. So these guys would occasionally take a sip just to test it. And eventually they pop open a barrel, an inspector who isn't on the take, and they get a nice mouthful of vinegar and water instead of Jack Daniels. Once that happens, another co-conspirator involved in the case, a bootlegger from Cincinnati who's in prison on another charge, says, I can implicate at least 20 people in St. Louis in this scheme to steal what amounted to over 800 barrels of whiskey from Jack Daniels.
Wow.
So once he rolls on those guys, not Dink Colbeck, he goes to prison later for an unrelated charge, but once this guy in Cincinnati rolls up on these guys, I think 23 people in St. Louis are arrested and they go to trial. If we could go to
Now we can go.
Now we can go to the next one.
Okay,
There's a trial held for these guys. The trial has to be held actually in Indiana because a judge believes no jury in St. Louis will convict anyone for stealing them whiskey during Prohibition, of course. So there's a trial held in Indiana. All of the accused are found guilty and they're going to be sent to Leavenworth Prison. But to get to Leavenworth from where the trial was being held in Indiana, the train had to come back through St. Louis. So the train that was carrying these guys comes back through St. Louis. It stops at Union Station, and there's 4,000 extra people in Union Station that day. They're not there to catch a train. They're there to give 3 cheers to all these people who had stolen whiskey for them during Prohibition. They were very popular men in St. Louis. People were promising to buy them dinner once they got back out and stuff. And these are 4 of the defendants you can see in this picture on the left here, including the guy on the very right of that picture is Edward O'Hare, who's the father of Edward Butch O'Hare, who O'Hare Airport in Chicago is named after.
amazing.
Fun little fact.
It is a fun little fact. Well, my favorite part of this whole story, I think where we're getting to totally, is the fact that all this happened here.
Yeah. Duncan
Right
Avenue
where the IKEA is.
runs right by there. It's so strange to think anytime, you're going to buy a dresser that you have to put together that someone was stealing whiskey from a warehouse there 100 years ago.
I mean, I usually want to drink when I'm there anyway, but
right.
we'll totally change that. Okay, so now it's my turn to talk about my favorite crimes. I get my own header here. So my 2 favorite crimes, and I'm not to be, Adam and I both discussed the fact that we're both not like true crime like aficionados, but once we got talking, we realized we may actually be secretly true crime aficionados. So one of my 2 favorite St. Louis crimes, the first one is the murder of Bertram Atwater. And it's not my favorite because I don't think murder's cool, but it is my favorite because it plays into my personal life. I live in Webster Groves, and Webster Groves would not be here as a community if Bertram Atwater had not been murdered. He was an artist, lived in Chicago. He was here creating some marketing materials for Union Station in 1896, and he decides to take the train out to the Webster Station near the Webster College. So he comes out here to see his sweetheart, who lives on Lee Avenue, in what is now Webster Groves. And when he gets there, he gets off the train, and some young guys tell him, you're going to get your hair cut before you go see your sweetheart. Why don't we hold your bags? Sure, why not? So he goes and gets his hair cut. Comes out of the barber shop, and he gets his bags from these guys. He tips them, and when he does that, they see, he's got a big wad of money in his pocket. So as he's walking to his fiance's house, he comes from the corner, and the young guys meet him there. They rob him at gunpoint, but unknowing to them, Bertram also had a gun. And so they both have, they pull guns, there's a shootout. Bertram is murdered, as well as one of the robbers is also shot as well. This, as you can imagine, completely erupts in the area that is now Webster Groves. All of these little tiny communities, overnight, they are suddenly alert to the fact that in their eyes, there is an element that is headed their way from the city, and they don't have any way to combat this. And so it's this crime that kicks off the movement to incorporate to become a city and to have, they actually bring in like this really tough cop to run their new police department, and they need a jail, they need all these things to become a city. And all of this, plays out, I guess, in modern times. It's fascinating as how Webster views itself, in relationships to the city. It's also one of the reasons that until recently, you cannot go to just a bar in Webster Groves, because when they incorporated it, because they're trying to keep the element out, they made a no saloon law.
Oh, wow.
And so that's why all the bars in Webster are restaurants and bars. There are no just standalone bars in Webster, right? So, and that's all thanks to Bertram Atwater. his great name and his story of his murder. And that's one of the robbers there being hanged down at the Four Courts, that building that we saw in the beginning. That I've already seen one question come up to talk more about Four Courts, and I will. So my next big one, and this one comes back to that debonair looking guy we saw in the beginning. This is the place we're looking at is the Southern Hotel, which is one of the grandest hotels in St. Louis in the 19th century. Site of one of the most famous fires in our city's history. There's a good story there. Hugh Brooks and Charles Preller, these two guys here, they meet on a boat on the way from England to America. They fall in love. They have decided to rendezvous in St. Louis once they are both done with what they need to do when they get to America. One's going to Boston, one's going to Philadelphia. So they do meet eventually back in St. Louis at the Southern Hotel. They are seen everywhere together until suddenly they are not seen together. They are only Hugh on the left there is seen, and he is suddenly one night seen flashing a whole lot of money that he didn't otherwise have, and he's not seen with Mr. Preller. He buys a trunk, and when he buys a trunk one night, the next morning he is seen without his beard leaving the hotel. So let's leave him there. He's off on his adventure. Of course, a few days later, there's a smell that starts to come from room 144, which is where they had been staying. The staff goes in. There's a trunk. There's a new trunk. Inside of this new trunk is a body. And so when they open it up, there is the body of Charles Preller. And so his body is in there, but there's a note attached to it that says, "So perish all traitors to the great cause." This throws the inspectors off for a minute, because they think maybe this is a political crime, this is some kind of, it's tied to the Irish Brotherhood. But no, they quickly realize that doesn't make any sense, and that Preller had actually been murdered by Brooks, because all of his money's gone, Brooks is gone. They start to put these things together. The cause of death was chloroform. So they start calling Brooks the little chloroformer. And so as Brooks is escaping, he has disguised himself. He's headed to San Francisco to head to New Zealand, which is where he told Charles Preller they were going. Once they had their rendezvous in St. Louis, the two of them were going to head off to New Zealand. And so he's headed to New Zealand. He's crossing the ocean. While he's crossing the ocean, our country and the world has actually caught up on this story, and they are publishing in the newspaper that he's about to land. And when he gets there, as you can see on the right, there is the arrest warrant sent by telegraph to New Zealand, that when he gets there, he's to be arrested and sent right back to St. Louis. So I can just picture him, crossing the Pacific, and he's gotten away with it, and no, they're just waiting for him at the dock. So when he gets there, his defense is that Preller died because he needed Brooks to help him out with a venereal disease type problem that he was having, and they used chloroform for that. And so that was his defense, and that he said that when he accidentally killed him, his response was then to take all of his money and leave the country and head out in disguise, which, that all adds up completely. So that they dig up the body, the evidence is not there that what Brooks said is what happened. It was still chloroform. And so he is put on trial in June of that year, and he appeals, even though he is sentenced to death, and he is hanged on August 10th at Four Courts, that building that we discussed earlier. Every paper in the country follows this story, and they follow it every few years after it happens. It's a story that just keeps, whenever you research it, shows up, just like we have stories that we kind of bring out every few years. Right. They revisit it, like, how could this have happened? And what's more of this story?
It's like when they made the TV show about OJ a few years ago. They just
Right,
dragged
like
out
they
that
keep
story.
doing it. And but what's interesting about this is there's no, I mean, from a modern view, you can kind of see this kind of glaring thing of it's two men, it's a crime of passion, like all these, that's not part of the story
Oh,
at
wow.
all. Like the events
Interesting.
barely, yeah, that's a side note. It's like a side thing. It's more this murder and leaving and disguise and rushing off. So it's a very interesting piece of St. Louis history.
Yeah.
When he is hanged, his mother comes from England, because both of these men are from England. Brooks's mother comes and she, does all these appeals for his life. And then when his body, the paper describes it so dramatically, his body drops and she sighs and says, "I hate this country now."
Oh,
She
wow.
turns and she leaves. That's the mother's story. It's very, very, yeah. As you can tell, I could talk about this one a whole bunch.
Yeah.
So that's my two favorite crimes, and your two favorite, or two crimes. Let's look at the Q&A. You want to do that? You want to look at the Q&A first?
Sure.
I'll let you take the first one.
So there's an interesting question here from Jody that says, how has fear of crime changed through the years, or has it? And I think that that's a really interesting question, especially, I was talking a lot about sort of Prohibition era gangsters for, a lot of what I was talking about. And, I think that there's a really interesting way that we talk about crime from that era as, it's these gangsters and they have this code that we seem to understand. And, they're committing these crimes that we've sort of, there's a nostalgia for them. They seem orderly. They seem like they make sense, even if they're crime and chaotic and all those things. But if you go back and read newspaper accounts from those times, the people living through it did not see it in that way at all. They thought there was chaos on the streets and, people shooting at each other for reasons that nobody could work out, and everyone double crossing one another for over slights that no one else could make sense out of. It just seemed like pure chaos that needed to be solved. And so I do think, there's always been this sort of fear of crime. It's sort of a distance from it. It's sort of a way that people study it and try to make sense of it that sort of neatens it out and makes it seem less chaotic. But for the people living in that moment, they would be shocked that we're sitting here, smiling and telling stories about the murders that happened in the past. The same way we might be shocked in, 40 years or something, 100 years,
Right.
people were talking about our era in a similar way.
Absolutely. And I would love to know more about what is that line? Where is that line crossed? Because, right, I mean, people joke all the time because as, the history I get to share, I get to talk a lot about cholera and I get really excited about talking about it. And people are always like, why did you just say that's a fun history? I'm like, well, it's not fun. It's not fun to have gone through it. But, there's this relative thing of what does it mean as a historian that it's fun, and interesting.
Right, yeah.
Because you're learning about people and the society that it happened in, and it's more about those pieces as well.
Right.
There is something cool about not just the fear of it, but the study and the consumption of true crime. There are studies published that show that the more true crime entertainment that you consume, the more likely you think it's going to happen to you.
Mm-hmm.
And that is where it gets into some social stuff, where that decides where are you going to live, how are you going to raise your children, who are you going to allow your children to be around. It's those things that really get good and interesting, not fun. Then my tone changes. Then it's really intriguing.
It's so, true crime is one of those things that on the surface, I feel like it does feel like, sort of, even if you're listening to the Dateline podcast or something, it doesn't feel quite as weighty. It's like, oh, I'm going to do this while I'm folding laundry. But when you start digging into it, even just a little bit, when you pry that lid up on true crime, it becomes very knotty very quickly. It's tough to grapple with and grasp all those elements at once. And so I think it's important to think about and talk about those things, even if we don't have all the answers to them ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, so this will be one of the CSTL tours. Will actually be a bus tour dealing with some of these crime aspects of St. Louis history. And it's when we have to acknowledge off the bat that we are a city with a crime problem. Like, so how do we celebrate these stories or go into them and investigate them on acknowledging the current climate and the current things that we are struggling with? And so we have that conversation right up front. And I always ask everyone in the room, like, well, not everyone is into crime. Obviously, everyone in this bus is. So like, what makes you, what makes you interested in it? And always there's Seems to be one little lady in the back that says that she's interested in how people get away with it.
Well, we don't have the answer to that. Yeah, no.
That's a whole nother, yeah. In case anybody's about to ask us that, we don't know how to get away with it. So we had someone ask about the jail in the Butt St. Louis slide, and I'm going to go real fast. Everybody, close your eyes and make you dizzy here. I'm going to go back really to the beginning. Okay, right there. So this building here is 4 courts. This is just west of where Busch Stadium is now. 4 Courts building was at the time, it was built in 1870. It's a large modern criminal justice facility. You see the morgue is there. They had the jail space that is in here, that space to the left, very modern for its time. And 4 Courts is demolished in 1927. And it wasn't just this, I mean, it was a huge building, but it was also the site of several big historic events itself. You have to go on the tour to hear about that.
Right.
This is all this,
some stuff.
yes, all about the tour. Let's see, any other good questions in there we're seeing?
There's a question here from Juan about the streets of the Cary Patch, where it was, and I wish I had written that down in my notes. It's one of those historical facts that I can never remember. I know it's up by Carr Square Park, but I don't remember exactly like what street is the boundary, but I can certainly look that up. It's in my notes and get that to you pretty easily.
Yeah, that is a good one. And another good question from Jody about how we talk about and react to crime depending on the race and the perpetrators. That's a big question, and that is one that's really good to kind of chew on and think about, because acknowledging that we are, in our history, only talking about a certain, we're talking about people that look like us, and what does that mean, and how do you handle that?
For sure. And back in the time of the, with the crimes being committed in the Cary Patch, that was there was a lot of sort of anti-Irish discrimination in St. Louis at the time, and that area of St. Louis, for people who weren't Irish, who didn't live in that area, was seen as this different and scary part of the city. The Post-Dispatch would send reporters in who would send dispatches back about what life was like in this other part of the city. And so, there was an element to the stories that came out of there where that crime is othering the people that live within that space, and marking that space as different and dangerous somehow, more dangerous than these other parts of the city where crimes were still occurring and people were poor and all those other kinds of things, but it was marking it as somehow different. So I think there's a lot of parallels there between sort of how we think about and talk about crime and how we view spaces as spaces where crime is going to be more likely to be committed depending on the kind of person.
Because nothing that we're getting into is about justice and how these crimes were. Gosh, 20 minutes. This is
yeah,
so much
not enough time to get into all of that.
We're just doing the fun ones.
Right.
But yeah, great question. And Hattie has a question about crime souvenirs and memorabilia. That's a good one. I mean, the idea of the clothing or of the murderer or the victim. I would love to know. Interesting to know if we have anything in our collections that.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
We should ask some people.
Yeah, we should ask our curators.
Yes, I think we know the people to ask on that one.
Yeah.
Let's see.
So
when did the Jack Daniels warehouse get torn down? Do you know that, Adam?
I want to say it was you know what? I'm not even going to venture a guess because now I have 3 different dates circulating through my head, but I will look that up and get back to you.
We have a question about where you would get chloroform. That would be fun if it was just that one sentence, but luckily they do add to that. Could you just pick it up at the corner store? And there would have been all kinds of pharmacies and of different kinds. The city also operated as a dispensary, is what was like the city pharmacy as well. So there's, the Walgreens on every corner definitely didn't have chloroform. They had all kinds of crazy chemicals and different things that you would use. And the amount of crime in St. Louis compared to other cities in the Victorian era. Oh, there's Tammy. I think she's going to make a stop.
Now, I hate being this person, but that seems to be my job. We want to stay in our time frame. There's a lot of great questions. That just means we need to bring you guys back again, put you back in the rotation. The next time that we're doing a talk is Tuesday at 11 a.m. And Amanda, if you can put up the last slide, that will show we have a short poll survey that we would love for you to complete if you have some time. And also, I know a lot of you are members and some staff, but if you're not a member, please go to the website that's noted right here and support us in any way that you can. We really appreciate it. Amanda and Adam, thank you so much for doing this great program. I think there's probably about 3 more hours that we could do, don't you think?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I've got plenty more.
Like I said, we were surprised at how much we could talk about this.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for everyone at home, and we hope to see you in the museum sometime really soon. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.